So the Sacrament of Reconciliation is, you might hear it called confession or penance or whatever, right? There's different terms for it. But the Sacrament of Reconciliation is an opportunity that God has given us, just like all the other sacraments coming from Christ, an opportunity to be able to be forgiven of actual sin that we commit during our life. And so one of the things we think about is, you say, we're baptized, so we've been saved. You know, God has rescued us from that sin, the powers of sin and death. We are no longer necessarily subject or bound by the powers of sin and death. However, we still can commit sin. And so we've got to talk about what that means and everything else. But so part of the fact that we can still commit sin, you're like, okay, so I've been baptized. You can only be baptized once, because when you are baptized, that is when you are pulled out of that power of sin and death. You are filled with sanctifying grace, with the life of Christ that we lost through the rebellion of Adam and Eve, that everybody is inherited when you're conceived, when you're born. You don't have that sanctifying grace because of what happened way back at the fall, the rebellion of Adam and Eve, where they rejected God and decided to make their own rules. And so now God says, I want you back. And so when Jesus came, he destroyed that power so that we could be rescued from that power. And we receive baptism, which is when we are dead to the power of sin, dead to the power of death. We are given a new life. We are reborn in God and in the Spirit, and we are filled with his sanctifying grace. And his sanctifying grace is his life. That is what we live with. That's like how we enter into heaven, is through that sanctifying grace, that union with God, which is what we were made for, which is what is our destiny, right? That's why we were made. That's our purpose, is to be united with God. And so everything we do is geared toward being united to God, or it should be geared toward being united with God. And when we don't live that, that's what we would call sin. Okay? So, and that's an important thing to distinguish, and that's why we started this class out with that understanding of who God is and what he did in creating us and bringing us forward, that God is a loving Father who wants nothing more than for his children to be united to him. And so that is what he wants. That is his greatest desire, is for us to be part of him. And so we want to have that view of God as a loving Father who created us to be able to share in his life. He created us to be able to share in his love. Because he loves so much, he wanted to give that back to us. And having that view puts sin in a different light. Because a lot of times we tend to view sin as a disobedience to rules, and that God is this rule maker or this taskmaster who's going to punish us when we sin. And then he punishes us in a way that we can't be part of him. But that's not what's happening. God is giving us direction. He's showing us how to live to be united to him. So he says, I've made you for a purpose. The purpose is to be united to me. Here is the way you do that. If you live according to the guidelines I'm giving you and to the guidance that I'm revealing to you, what he calls his commandments, if you live according to that, you will have life. You will have happiness. You will have joy. And when we fail to do that, or we make the choice to do something different, the natural consequence of that is death or destruction or not happiness, okay? It's not God issuing a punishment to us. It's just, this is the consequence of you not doing what you're made for, okay? And that distinction is a very important distinction, because we are living in a faith of relationship. Our faith, our belief system is one of a relationship. It's a relationship of you and me to Jesus. That's the relationship. We need to have a relationship with Jesus Christ. Being united to him, he draws us into the life of the Trinity. And that's how we experience the life of the Trinity, is by being united to Jesus Christ. And when we break that relationship, when we do something to harm that relationship, that's sin. Okay? And if we have that understanding of sin, that's an important backdrop to everything that we're going to talk about today. Because it's not that, oh gosh, I made God mad at me, and now I've got to do something to appease him so that he's not mad at me anymore. That's not what's going on. Okay? It's, oh no, I've harmed the relationship. How do I go make it right? How do I get myself back to a point where I'm now living in that relationship in a proper way? Not, oh, I've got to make God happy with me again. Okay? That's a different distinction. So that's not, so think about that. It's that, I'm coming back to my Father saying, Father, I'm sorry. I didn't live like you showed me how to live, and I've done something wrong, and I do want to live the way you want me to live, or that you've shown me the right way to live. It's not that, oh no, I'm going to be punished, and so therefore I better do something different, right? I better be nice to God so that he doesn't punish me. Okay? So we use terms like punishment because it's easy to understand. We use terms like that when we describe the impact of sin, just because that's kind of the way to understand it, but it's not in that sense of God, being mad at me and issuing a punishment at me, okay? So we'll try to talk through that as we go through this, but that's kind of the backdrop, okay? And where I wanted to start in kind of talking through this is, I guess, kind of give a definition of sin, because people kind of have a misinterpretation of sin in a sense. And so probably the best definition of sin I've ever heard is this one. And it goes like this. It says, sin is a failure to live your freedom excellently. A failure to live your freedom excellently. So let's break that down a minute. So obviously it's a failure, meaning I haven't done something right. I failed to accomplish what I was trying to do. So what was I trying to do? I was trying to live my freedom. What is my freedom? My freedom is being separated from the power of sin, being separated from the power of death. That's my freedom. Jesus set me free from that, which means I have the ability to live a life that God has shown me is the way to happiness. I have that ability now. Before Jesus came and before I was baptized, I didn't even have that ability. It wasn't even possible because I wasn't free. I was enslaved. So now I'm free. So now how do I live out my freedom? I live out my freedom by doing what accomplishes my purpose. What's my purpose? My purpose is to be united to God. So if I can live every moment in a way that unites me to God, then I'm living my freedom excellently. Every choice I make that is not moving me to that relationship with God, or that is separating me from that relationship with God, that is failing to live my freedom excellently. And that's what you would call sin. Okay? Notice I never said anything about a rule or a law. Because when God speaks about his commands, or when he speaks about or when the Bible talks about God's commandments, it's speaking about this is the direction God has given us to achieve that relationship with him. Okay? Think about it that way, about in the context of relationship, not in the context of rules, right? Our religion, even though we have a bunch of precepts, and even though we have a bunch of things that we try to follow and do, it's not a religion of rules and following the rules. It is these are the mechanisms by which God has revealed to us that we achieve that relationship with him. Okay? So that's the first element. If we think about sin in that context, then we can look at sin in a different way. And I think the first way to start with that is probably in 1 John. So in 1 John, he is the Apostle John who lived the longest, and he was the disciple who Jesus loved. You know, he was the one that was laying on Jesus' chest at the Last Supper. He writes his epistles all about love. He is very much speaking about love. And because he recognizes that that is what God is, right? God is love. And the one gift that will last forever is love. Because of the theological virtues, the faith, hope, and love, right? Faith you don't need once you achieve your relationship with God. Once you're in heaven, you don't need faith anymore because you've achieved what you believe. You don't need hope anymore because you've achieved that which you hoped for. But love is always there because that's who God is. And so love is eternal. And so when he writes all about love. But one of the things he says in his 5th chapter, in verse 3, he says, "This is what the love of God is, keeping his commandments." He says, nor are his commandments burdensome, because every child of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, is our faith. Because our faith is in God, and when we truly live out our faith, we're living out the things that God has asked us to do. So faith is more than just a mental assent or a belief. It's a belief plus an action. And when you bring those things together, the action is keeping his commandments. And I love the phrase, his commandments are not burdensome, because again, it's not like it's a list of rules and regulations. This is how you achieve eternal happiness. This is how you achieve happiness, is you follow this direction. And that's why Jesus tells us that his yoke is easy and his burden is light, because it's the way that you accomplish your purpose, which is to be united to him. So that's one element. Then later in that chapter, in verse 16, he says, if anyone sees his brother commit a sin that is not a deadly sin, he has only to pray, and God will give life to his brother, provided that it is not a deadly sin. There is sin that leads to death, and I'm not saying that you must pray about that. Every kind of sin, every kind of wickedness is sin, but not all sin leads to death. And so that's a very interesting couple of verses, because it's something very new for people who aren't Catholic, usually. The fact that there are 2 different kinds of sin, okay? And you'll hear, the language of the church is you have venial sin and mortal sin. And so you hear John talking about 2 different types of sin. There is sin that is deadly, that leads to death, and there is other sin. And so what the church says is the sin that leads to death is mortal, because it's deadly, mortal. Other sins are venial because they're not mortal. They don't destroy life. And what does John mean by that? What does he mean by deadly? Well, let's think back to Genesis. What did God tell Adam and Eve would happen if they ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? They would die. But when they ate it, did they physically die? No, they didn't. But what did die? The relationship with God. They rebelled. They cut themselves off from the life of God because they decided they were going to make their own decisions about what is right and wrong. So they just determined they were God, and they cut themselves off from that life. And as a result of that, they sold themselves into the slavery of sin and death. And that's why death entered the world, because they did eventually physically die, but not at that moment. And that's the same thing John's talking about here, is he says there is sin that is deadly, meaning there is sin that cuts you off from the life of God. Meaning, even though I've been baptized, and even though I've been freed from this power of sin and death, there is sin that I can commit that would cut me off from the life of God, and therefore I could not enter heaven if I died in that state, because I've cut myself off from the life of God. So I can't enter into his life for all eternity because I've said no. Okay? It's a choice I've made. It's not a punishment God is issuing upon me, right? I've made the decision to say, no, God, I don't want you, I want me. And when I make that choice, God, being a loving Father, honors that choice. He never forces himself upon us. He's always calling us back, but he never forces himself upon us. And so he's calling me, but when I say no, and I cut that off, then I've made that decision to say, I don't want your life. And when I make that decision, that's deadly, meaning that says I'm not entering into God's life for all eternity. So how do we fix that if that happens? Well, that's where the Sacrament of Reconciliation comes into play, okay? And so this is God's gift to us, his mercy of, I get it, you made that choice, but guess what? I'm still here, and I'm still going to give you that ability to say, yep, I messed up. Let me go come back and tell you, God, I really do want to have your life. I don't want to cut myself off from that. And that's the Sacrament of Reconciliation, okay? So when you think about what is the difference between a sin that is deadly and a sin that is not deadly, or a mortal and a venial sin, a mortal sin is something of a serious nature. So this is the way the church describes it. It's something of a serious nature. So the matter of the sin is serious. Breaking one of the 10 Commandments is a perfect example of something that is a serious matter. And if I've done it knowing that the action is sinful, okay, so if you didn't know it's a sin, it's not mortal because you didn't do it knowingly. And you have to have made the conscious choice, meaning if someone coerced you or if there were some mitigating circumstances, it may not have been a mortal sin. But if it is a serious matter that you've committed a sin knowingly by your choice, that is a mortal sin. And you basically made the choice saying, God, I don't want your life. I want to make my own choices. And that's where we have that problem. So venial sins are then those other sins that John talks about that are wickedness that still hurt the life and relationship with God. They damage the relationship, but they don't completely cut us off from the relationship. So it's not us saying no to God, but it's sort of a damage or a hurt to the relationship. Like in a marriage, when we're in a marriage relationship, I might make a choice that offends my bride, that is not choosing her or the relationship. It's something that's selfish or chooses me. Well, that damages the relationship, but I'm not getting a divorce, right? It's not that I'm saying I don't want to be married anymore. It's just I've done something that's damaging to a relationship. So again, that's not something you just sweep under the carpet. You still come back and apologize and try to make it right. And again, that's where confession comes in, is that even for venial sin, I can come back to confession and tell God I'm sorry and heal that relationship that I've damaged, the thing that I've done to kind of put a chink in the relationship that I have with God and kind of make it right. Because I recognize that, oh no, I'm not living the life that God has called me to, so I want to do something to fix that and to make it right. And so that's really what the Sacrament of Reconciliation is all about, is making that relationship right, okay? So that's kind of gets into the difference between a venial and a mortal sin. And that's one of the things that I think is fairly unique about Catholicism, is recognizing that difference between a venial and a mortal sin. So one thing to also point out is knowing that almost all of you are coming from different faith traditions than Catholicism, is that there is a philosophy and a belief out there that says that once I've been saved, I can't lose my salvation. And this idea that, hey, I've accepted Jesus Christ, or in the Catholic world, right, I've been baptized, so therefore I'm going to heaven. It doesn't kind of matter what I've done. Or if I've made that profession of faith, oh, then I'm saved and I'm going to go to heaven. It doesn't really matter what I do. Ultimately, I'm still going to heaven. I want to try to live a good life, but, ultimately I've been saved. And the problem with that philosophy is it's not scriptural. And if you look at Scripture, all through the New Testament, we hear Paul talking about it, we hear Jesus talking about it, we hear James talking about it, that you will be judged on your works, on what you do. That is how you will be judged. But I think the best place to look at this is in Ezekiel, in the Old Testament, in Ezekiel. And I won't read the whole thing because it's kind of long, but I think it's Ezekiel 18, where Ezekiel talks through, and the people are complaining to God because he is rescuing peoples who have lived very poor lives. They have not lived the covenant, and they have not lived according to the commandments of God, but now they're turning their lives around. And he's like, you're not fair. You're not being fair, because we've been faithful all the time, and yet you're bringing all these other people. And God says, whose ways are fair and not fair? He says, I'm God. Who are you? And he said, here's the reality of the situation, is that someone who has been righteous his whole life and yet turns away from that righteousness, it will be as though he never was righteous. And someone who has been unrighteous his whole life but turns away from his unrighteousness and then lives righteous, it will be as though he was always lived righteously. And so this idea that once you're baptized, or once you've accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior, or once you've made that profession of faith, that you can't lose your salvation, that's not a scriptural notion. That's not a true notion. And that's what John's talking about here, is that, yeah, even though you've been rescued from the power of sin and death, you can still cut yourself off from God's life by making those choices that say, no, God, I don't want you, I want me. And when we make those choices, that's when we've separated ourselves. And so we can enter into death. And that's why Paul says, even Paul himself says, I run the race every day because I would hate to be saving all these people and then lose my own reward. So he's always diligent about, as he says, working out my salvation with fear and trembling, because he recognizes the awesomeness of God and the ultimate holiness that God is, and that standard to which he's been called to enter into that life and that relationship. And so that's why he can make those statements. Okay? So let's look at that. Let's take another step into that now for what is the Sacrament of Reconciliation. Because one of the other sticking points about the Sacrament of Reconciliation is only God can forgive sins. So why am I going to confession with a priest who's not God? And so in the Catholic Church, the Sacrament of Reconciliation is when I enter into a conversation with the priest, and the priest, in